aggregate metrics can lie, completely inverting the truth of the underlying data. This happens when the top-line numbers you use to guide your business strategy point in the exact opposite direction of operational reality. The danger here isn't that this is some exotic mathematical anomaly. It's that this occurs routinely in standard business reporting, trapping decision-makers who accept those aggregate numbers at face value. Take a concrete scenario. A regional health system is reviewing its surgical outcomes. They discover that Hospital A, their flagship academic center, actually has a higher overall mortality rate for surgeries than Hospital B, which is a smaller community facility in a neighboring city. Obviously, the board is uncomfortable with this. On the surface, the immediate takeaway is that patients are safer at the smaller Hospital B. A consultant is brought in to investigate the discrepancy. But when we break that data down by surgical complexity, the picture entirely inverts. Consider the performance for routine surgeries. Hospital A has a 1.0% mortality rate compared to Hospital B's 1.3%. Now, for complex surgeries, Hospital A stands at 8.0% compared to Hospital B's 7.5%. What does this mean? Hospital A actually has better outcomes for every single category of surgery, yet its combined mortality rate, 4.5%, is nearly double Hospital B's 2.5%. Hospital A wins each specific category, but loses overall. The culprit here is case mix. Hospital A's aggregate looks worse because it treats much sicker patients on average, not because it provides worse care. We can conceptualize exactly how this inversion happens. If we plot out the data points for Group A and Group B, within each specific subgroup, the trend goes in one very clear direction. Outcomes increase as treatment intensity increases. But when those distinct subgroups are combined into a single aggregate, the trend reverses. That aggregate average creates a totally false narrative, simply because the subgroups differ fundamentally in their size and their relative baseline positions. This phenomenon is known as Simpson's paradox. It arises whenever the aggregate relationship between two variables differs from the within-group relationships, and this happens specifically because the groups themselves differ in composition. It's absolutely crucial to understand that this isn't a mathematical trick. It's just a routine consequence of how aggregation interacts with composition. An aggregate is, at its core, a weighted average of group results. Change the weights, and you inevitably change the answer. And this dynamic creates a severe analytical trap for leadership. An aggregate metric tells one story, but each subgroup, when examined separately, tells the exact opposite story. An executive looks at the aggregate and acts on its implication. What they completely miss is that taking this action would worsen rather than improve their underlying performance. For example, redirecting patients from Hospital A to Hospital B based purely on the aggregate data would actually place them in a facility with objectively worse outcomes for their specific condition. This trap operates silently across all sectors of business analytics. Consider human resources. A company audits its hiring rates and finds men are hired at 32% versus just 26% for women. This prompts a major diversity audit. But when disaggregated by department, every individual department actually has a higher hiring rate for women. The trap was composition. Women were applying disproportionately to departments with fewer total openings. Now consider retail. A chain reports a 2% decline in year-over-year same-store sales, yet every individual store grew. How? The chain had simply opened new stores in low-volume markets and closed old ones in high-volume markets, shifting the aggregate weight. Finally, think about software. A SaaS company sees its average customer satisfaction decline, even though satisfaction is actually up in their enterprise, mid-market, and small business tiers. The reality is the company added a massive volume of small business customers who inherently score lower, and that masked the improvements across every single tier. Now, a related but distinct analytical error you need to watch out for is the ecological fallacy. This happens when you draw conclusions about individuals from data about groups. Group-level patterns simply do not always apply to the individuals within those groups. Inferring individual behavior from a group average is often both mathematically and logically flawed. For example, historical voting data frequently shows that states with higher average incomes vote more Republican. It's an ecological fallacy to assume that higher income individuals within those states vote more Republican. Often, poorer states as a whole skew Republican, but within a given state, lower-income individuals might vote more Democratic, while higher-income individuals vote more Republican. The state-level pattern and the individual-level pattern are answering entirely different questions. In a business context, if a company observes that its top-performing teams have higher average employee tenure, it cannot automatically conclude that longer-tenured individuals are the higher performers. The high-performing teams might just be older teams that have survived past organizational changes. You cannot cleanly infer individual behavior from team-level averages.
So, faced with these structural data paradoxes, which view of the data should an executive board actually trust?
The correct view depends entirely on the specific causal question being asked. Here's how you navigate it. If the decision is about a future patient walking in with a known risk profile, the disaggregated data is what matters. It accurately predicts their specific outcome based on their condition. But if the decision is about overall hospital portfolio performance in the current population, the aggregate data is highly relevant. It reflects the system's total reality. For strategic decisions about specific customer segments, use segment-level data. For decisions about overall portfolio performance, use the aggregate, provided you have a clear understanding of the composition that's driving it. To systematize this understanding, analysts look for moderating variables. A moderating variable is a third variable that fundamentally changes how the first two variables are related. We call this an interaction effect. For instance, the relationship between a hospital and mortality depends heavily on case complexity. The relationship between hiring and gender depends on the specific department being applied to. And the relationship between retail sales and time depends on the mix of open stores. Whenever a relationship of interest can plausibly depend on a moderating variable, you must treat aggregate analysis with severe caution. Modern artificial intelligence assistants can serve as powerful reasoning partners to spot these structural distortions before any capital or strategy is committed. Here's how you do it. First, provide the AI with the metric and the specific decision it's informing. Then, instruct it to suggest moderating variables that might cause the aggregate to differ from within group patterns. Finally, force the AI to construct a hypothetical scenario where the aggregate and disaggregated data tell entirely opposite stories. This exercise demands a concrete evaluation of whether Simpson's paradox is operating right there in the dataset in front of you. You should rigorously interrogate any aggregate metric driving a critical decision with 4 specific questions. First, what is the composition of the population this aggregate is built from? Second, has that composition changed over time, or does it differ across the groups being compared? Third, if this metric were broken down by an obvious moderating variable, would the pattern hold? And fourth, is the decision being made about the aggregate as a whole, or about specific cases that might not match the aggregate? The ultimate institutional defense against Simpson's paradox is establishing a habit of asking about composition. Whenever groups are compared, you have to determine if they differ in composition in ways that affect the final outcome. If they do, the comparison must be structurally adjusted before any conclusions are drawn. Now, this doesn't mean you have to disaggregate every single metric. Disaggregating too far just produces tiny subgroups that are dominated by random statistical variation rather than genuine actionable differences. Effective leaders demand the level of aggregation that is meaningful for the decision at hand, supported by reliable estimates. The next time a dashboard presents a clear and simple trend, ask yourself, are you seeing the truth or are you just being misled by composition?